Is there a crisis in serious nonfiction publishing? That is something we keep hearing. Maybe there is a crisis, maybe there isn't. And if there is one, what can you do about it? I'm John Gazvinian. You are with Scholars to Storytellers, where we help scholars. We used to say senior scholars, but now we help all kinds of scholars in the humanities and social sciences to achieve trade book success, taking you from a concept to an agent-ready proposal in 9 months or less. If you have not already checked us out, please do. www.scholarstostorytellers.com. And you'll see all the wonderful things we do, like retreats and campus workshops and individualized coaching and all kinds of things like that, including free videos. This is one of those videos that we are happy to share with you completely free of charge. It's a conversation I'm really excited to be having with three fantastic and deeply experienced professionals who have worked in the publishing industry for a long time, who know way more about it than I do, on the specific question of is there a crisis in serious nonfiction trade publishing? Now, you may not have actually thought about this at all. You may not be aware that people are even talking about this. If you are in academia, of course, you're used to a very different kind of publishing, academic publishing. The whole world of trade is probably a little bit new to you, and that's probably why you're drawn to our content and our material and our website. However, you found your way here. The whole world of it might be still a bit of a mystery, and so it may be news to you that within the world of trade publishing, there have been a lot of conversations recently about whether we are experiencing a particularly difficult time in the types of books you all do, which is basically serious nonfiction as opposed to like fiction or self-help or or gardening or whatever, which, as you know, trade publishing does a lot of, right? It's serious nonfiction. Our kinds of books are only one small segment of the trade publishing world, but it's a segment that's been struggling a little bit. And we want to talk about why that might be and what you can do about it if you are just beginning to put your toe in the water. So let me set up why we're doing this and why we're even having this conversation in the first place. A couple of things have happened over the past year and a half, I'd say roughly. One of them is that Donald Trump became president again. Another of those is that AI has really taken off. Another of those is a longer trend, which is that simply people's attention spans are shrinking and so on and so forth. But all of these have kind of created a sort of perfect storm. At least this is the premise. And there was a big piece, or big within the publishing industry, I guess, a piece that came out in the Wall Street Journal about 2 or 3 months ago called "Are Dad Books a Dying Breed?" Now, you may not have you not be familiar with this term "dad book," but the reference, it's a sort of cheeky reference to those big doorstop books like on the Civil War and so on that you give to your dad or your uncle, people who love to read those kinds of books. But it dealt with a larger category of books, which is, this demographic of people who love to consume smart nonfiction books, which is exactly the demographic you are all trying to reach and that we're trying to help you all reach. Some things have happened recently, which is that that the publishing industry has not seen people buying these books as much. There are speculation about why. The main reasons that are offered are one, if you are interested in kind of, a lot of times these books are political, they're about big, tough, current events, topics, difficult things that are happening around the world. Well, as you may have noticed, the typical readership for that book, for that kind of book, the sort of progressive, educated American who listens to NPR and reads the New York Times, is pretty demoralized and has spent a lot of the last year feeling kind of depressed and burnt out on the news cycle and not really wanting to read yet another book about yet another depressing thing. So that's part of why we're seeing this, supposedly. Another is simply that there is a much, much larger variety of options available for people who are interested in learning about cool stuff. So it used to be that you really wanted to learn about the Civil War, you'd have to go and buy a 600-page book. These days, you can tune in to a 20-minute YouTube video. You can watch a TikTok. You can listen to a really smart, interesting podcast, maybe for 30 or 40 minutes. You can read some Substacks. There's a lot of different, you can even have a chat for 10, 15 minutes with AI, with ChatGPT, and then you might learn a few things. You might also, be led astray, but the fact is you can still have an interesting conversation and learn some things. So the options are much more proliferated now for people who are interested in learning about the kinds of stuff they might once have turned to nonfiction books for. And then, of course, you pile upon that, the general addled nature of all of our attention spans and so forth, and it makes for a perfect storm. So there have been these pieces that have been coming out. The Guardian did a similar one for the UK a few months earlier about is there a crisis in serious nonfiction publishing? And in fact, the numbers are there. I mean, there has been a drop in sales. So one thing we started to notice about a year ago is that publishers were noticing that these books weren't selling as well. And then a few months after that, I started to hear from agents that publishers weren't taking chances quite as much, and so agents weren't willing to take chances quite as much. So for the last 6 to 8 months, we've been sort of navigating that new terrain. So to help me kind of understand that terrain and to unpack whether this is even true or just a kind of tempest in a teapot or, something that's blown out of proportion, or maybe it's just a temporary secular kind of cycle, I have invited three of our people who from our community. Two of them are our senior coaches. If you haven't met them yet, they're terrific. This is a kind of behind the scenes in the Scholars to Storytellers family. Um, One of them is Kathy Huck, who is a very, very experienced nonfiction editor. She has worked for many years at publishing houses like HarperCollins, Simon& Schuster, Macmillan. She's edited a whole bunch of New York Times bestsellers, including books by Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, CIA Director George Tenet, and others. She is one of the absolute giants of nonfiction publishing, and I'm really, really honored that she is part of our community. And in fact, if you'd like to work with Kathy, you also have that option through Scholars to Storytellers. She's one of our senior coaches now on a freelance basis as well. We also have Clive Priddle, who's been with us for almost exactly a year now, I think. Also, one of the great giants of nonfiction publishing. Clive retired a little over a year ago from Public Affairs books. Public Affairs, if you're not familiar, of course, is one of the absolute great publishers of serious nonfiction books, particularly of a kind of political policy and kind of current events persuasion. Clive also had worked at HarperCollins before that, both in the US and in the UK. He has worked with four Nobel Prize winners. He's edited people like Esther Duflo, Kishore Mahbubani, Susan Williams, Ibram X. Kendi, Muhammad Yunus, and the list goes on and on. And I'm really honored and pleased. Clive is also part of our Scholars to Storytellers team. Some of you may have already met him at our retreats and other things. And finally, I've also recently made the acquaintance, and I'm very pleased to have done so, of Sarah Levitt, who is an outstanding agent who specializes in serious nonfiction. One of the smartest agents out there. I think I really enjoyed the conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago, learned a lot from it, and I'm really pleased that she's now also kind of part of our network of agents that we will be sending lots of stuff to. So Sarah is an agent at Evitas. She represents mostly nonfiction, a lot of critically acclaimed, award-winning New York Times best-selling nonfiction, including two MacArthur geniuses and counting. She represents a lot of journalists, academics, historians, scientists, musicians. She's got a lot of great ideas, and I'm excited to learn from her as well. So I'm going to shut up now and open up the floor with just a really open-ended question. This is just going to be an informal conversation, free-flowing. So whoever wants to jump in can jump in. Is there a crisis in serious nonfiction publishing? And if so, how bad is it? Take it away, anyone who wants to.
All right, I'll jump.
Okay. I'll jump after you. Go for it.
Okay, so I used to work for a guy who loved to say that in the history of publishing, the first great event in publishing was Gutenberg's development of the printing press, and the second great headline in publishing was "and publishing is about to die." So publishing does have crises, and always has had. When the industry has reconfigured itself, when there's been a lot of conglomeratization historically, that's made a huge difference. When sometimes it's generational. A tier of professionals moves, and it suddenly feels like the industry has changed and become unrecognizable in some way from the past. So there are cycles in publishing, and publishing has a habit of rebounding. That said, there's definitely something going on in nonfiction right now, and it is harder for agents and it's harder for editors. And I think there are a number of forces that are contributing to that. I'm sure we can all get into some of those. I will speak maybe about one on behalf of the dad book, since I'm the only dad in this conversation. And that is that I think for very well-intentioned reasons, publishing has changed its priorities over the last several years, and I think it deliberately intended to do that. It started after the Me Too movement, and I think publishing took a long, hard look at itself as an industry and said, we're old and white and male, and we're going to do something about that. And it did. And if you look at inside publishing companies now, they are very largely female or non-male. They're much less white than they used to be. And that is an entirely good thing in terms of encouraging more voices into the industry and more receptiveness to different kinds of talent that's producing books and book ideas. But the audience for books didn't change at the same speed that the employment within the industry changed. So I'm going to suggest that among the things that has caused a problem for nonfiction is that the dad book buyer, who I think is still very much there, has been underserved by the change in the people who now work in the industry. And that is agents, publishers, and booksellers. If you look across the entire industry, there's not a lot of dads.
All right. Provocative response. I appreciate that. Anything from the non-dads in the
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I was
Sarah.
going to kick off similar to Clive to say that, like, if Derrida was in publishing, he'd say it's always already in crisis. It's been on the edge of extinction for as long as I've been in book publishing, I would say. But to also agree with Clive, the shape of the disaster is quite different. There used to be a kind of truism that pending sort of what political party was in the office, book sales would follow suit, and so on and so forth. But now a lot of things have been broken. So I think what really is unprecedented is just the complete dissolution of media. One way to think about writing and selling a book is it's always an act of failure. It's kind of like playing a video game at every level. So like level one is you have to actually sell that book to a mainstream trade publisher. Level two is that publisher has to sell it to their sales force. Level three, sales force needs to sell it to all of the outlets, all of the booksellers, right? Four, a bookstore has to stock it, distribution. Five, people need to know about it, right? So that's not the bookstore, that's the publisher assigning an in-house publicity person to do publicity for a book, which is really, really hard to do because back in the day, all you needed, to your point, John, was right a New York Times book review, which maybe 2% of the books that get published get their New York Times book review, which is sad and awful and the truth. And NPR and maybe CBS Sunday. And now what we're finding is the kind of generalist book media that publicity folks in-house pitch don't necessarily move the dial. I think A, it's very hard to get those gets, but B, where do you reach readers? And there's no good way to reach readers. I'd say, unlike the UK, we don't have our version of BBC. So that is a very huge reason why it's very hard to find readers. The other big reason is there are less readers, or more accurately, the people who read really read. They read deeply. Those who don't, which is the majority, right, in terms of the attention span, are lacking the space and time and critical thinking. And also to John's point, right, like serious nonfiction, there's a huge emotional register. A lot of it is maybe not what someone wants to reach for at the end of like a soul crushing day. So we are in crisis, but all is not lost. And I think we are in the midst of change. And when that change settles is only going to be seen retrospectively.
I'm going to hand over to, before I hand over to Kathy, just, sorry, your audio and your video are just a little bit choppy. I don't know if there's any way you can make any kind of adjustments to that while we listen to Kathy.
Okay.
Thank you. But thank you. We caught like 95% of that, I think. So
Yeah, I was just going to agree with all of that being, in publishing for 30 years, I probably saw at least two cycles that I can think of. Was the rise of the internet, and the web, and then when Amazon came along, and we saw that as a huge force of, we were going to see bookstores go away. We were going to see the bricks and mortar stores go away. And that definitely has corrected, but we are now seeing Barnes and Noble coming a force again, and we're seeing independent bookstores becoming a force again. And, I think the internet is definitely has been advantageous and disadvantage. Um, what's the word I'm looking for? It has been against publishing, in the sense that, we can get the word out so much more about a book, but then it's in a medium that can get lost because there's so many millions of people online. So we can have book talk and we can have all these great things, but also we just don't have the Oprahs anymore to go on a TV show, or the New York Times to get a great review. It's so the concentration is just not there anymore, and I think that's been pointed out as well. But I also think there is this perfect storm of the Trump administration and the PTSD that people have, about that, and we're seeing a rise in fiction right now,
Right.
because of it, and particularly science, sci-fi and fantasy and romance. People just want to escape, but I think hopefully that will be this ebb and flow that we'll see. I think it all goes back to storytelling, right? This is the
Mhm.
how we began writing. We have the Odyssey out right now, and to see that as something that's 1,000 years old, and we're still going back to that story because it's a great story. And I think any sort of great nonfiction is going to be about storytelling, and that's always going to be of interest to people, whether they're reading or not. And I think that's where it really goes back to. I don't know if that gets off too much of subject, but I
No.
think trying to give you a little bit of a positive viewpoint. And I also I take offense to dad books too, because I love reading serious nonfiction, and I always felt it kind of funny that it's just like, no, I want to read a huge book about World War II. It's a huge Stephen Ambrose fan, so and Eric Larson, who I love now. But and I think also really trying to obviously understand the landscape that we're in, but then looking at ways in which we can work within that landscape. So, always going back to storytelling. Unfortunately, I think for serious nonfiction, they do have to point to social media, because that's where people are getting information about books. I know that Sarah probably sees this a lot, is, a lot goes back to platform for a lot of these books, not necessarily serious nonfiction, but publishers really look at, the numbers of, Instagram followers or TikTok followers and all of that. Not that I'm asking academics to get
Mhm.
those numbers up, but there's something about that they have a visibility. And how can you work that? How can you leverage something like that? Will be interesting in this landscape, I think.
So I have a few questions based on what we've heard so far. One of them, Sarah mentioned the political cycle not being as relevant as it was, right? And so this is one curiosity that I have that I keep coming back to, because we hear again, and the way I set this up at the beginning, that one of the reasons that is often cited for why nonfiction is struggling a bit right now is the political cycle that we're in. Because of the last year, people are demoralized. They're looking for escape, as Kathy said. They're looking more at, romantasy as a fact, is the category that's doing better than anything else in publishing. People can't write these books fast enough. They're flying off the shelves because people seem to be looking for some kind of escapism. They want to hide from the real world because it's too depressing. The obvious sort of corollary of that then is, assuming that the political cycle turns around,
Mhm.
will this turn around, or is this a larger secular kind of decline that we're witnessing, right? This is the big question that I don't have resolved in my mind. In other words, if there's some kind of sudden rejuvenation in kind of Democratic Party prospects at the midterms in November, and people start to go back to feeling excited and feeling like they can actually have some kind of agency. And by people, I mean the kinds of people who typically read these books, who I think tend to skew a little bit democratic. Um, you know, are we going to look back a few months from now and just kind of say, oh, well, we were worried for no reason. Actually, these books are bouncing back. I mean, I think because, and to sort of situate this in the big picture for people listening, um, you know, in the first Trump administration, right, 2017, 2018, 2019, it was like a heyday of serious nonfiction books, right? Because there was this whole kind of energy around like resist and, you need to fight back and da, da, da. And so people wanted to educate themselves by going out and buying books about race and climate change and whatever the big topics were because they wanted to arm themselves with information and so they could, fight the good fight as they saw it. But this second time around, there's just been this collective feeling of like, oh, the hell with it, we're screwed. Like, I don't know, nothing we can do seems to make any difference. Why should I go and read a bunch of depressing books about things that I can't change and control? I'm going to go and read a fantasy novel instead, about, aliens having sex, which seems to be the direction that readers are going in. So which is it? Is it I mean, do you expect to change when the political, after if the political winds shift, as we expect at some point they probably will? Or is this something deeper?
So I want to come back to the assumption that political books don't sell, which I don't think is necessarily true. I think if you look at Maggie Haberman's Regime Change, hugely successful book, sold a ton of copies in exactly the same style of publishing that Bob Woodward has sold in the past. And so again, I think the appetite exists for a good book. What I think is really interesting is how journalistically there are so many fewer people doing work of that quality in that space now. If you look back sort of 20 years, the number of people who covered politics and covered it extensively in news organizations, the number of news organizations, the number of local papers that provided writers with a chance to practice their writing. It was an ecosystem, and that ecosystem is much, much reduced. And I was thinking when Kathy brought up Eric Larson, I too am a huge fan of Eric Larson, a brilliant man, and a lovely man too, and a dedicated writer to his craft in every good way. Started out life as a journalist, always thinks of himself first and foremost as a reporter in nonfiction, gathers his facts like a reporter gathers his facts before he then spins his story. There aren't enough people now getting the kind of bedrock experience that Eric Larson had as a young journalist for them to then convert into brilliant writers of nonfiction. So some of it is that we've lost the training, we've lost the discipline, and we've lost the training, and it's a qualitative decline. I think really good nonfiction is really hard to do well. There aren't a lot of people who can do it well. And there are now fewer of them in that space. And that's got nothing to do with publishing. That's got to do with a much larger, media ecosystem, in my view. But again, I come back to the audience. I think the audience is still there. I'm just not sure that we're finding as many really, really talented people as we used to, or that people are not reaching the same levels.
That's an interesting point, right? So if that's the case, then in that case, that's a great segue for sort of what can our audience do about that? Let's say, I mean, if you're an academic and you want to write a political book or any kind of serious nonfiction book, it doesn't have to be political. If you're saying that the quality isn't out there in the way that it used to be, or the sort of pathways aren't out there, where does that leave us? I mean, I mean, you have a very good sense, Clive, of what our audience is like. You've talked to a lot of our clients and potential clients, the kinds of people tuning in to watch something like this. What can they do? How do you become a sort of Maggie Haberman or Eric Larson when you're, on the tenure track and busy producing a certain kind of writing, and you keep hearing that actually the trade industry is really tough to break into and so on, and tougher than ever?
Well, I reckon that Kathy and Sarah can speak to what it takes to succeed because they've taken authors through that journey. I would just say this, that it's tough. And so if academics want to write at that level, they really have to commit to making that level of effort. And I think not underestimating the task that you're taking on, not underestimating how high that bar is, not thinking that somehow just a sort of slightly easier and more popular kind of language will turn your book from an academic book to a trade book. Those assumptions you have to set aside and really understand that the people whose sales you would love to emulate, everybody would love to emulate David Graham. It's incredibly hard. He's just, he's almost sui generis. I mean, Patrick Radden Keefe, everybody wants to write that book and have that track. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it requires a lot of very specialized attention and support, I think. But if there are fewer people coming through journalism, this is the upside of the conversation, then there's a space, there's a gap. So I think the challenge is, if you want to be that person, then go for it. Reach high. Understand that it's a reach, but reach high.
And we are there to help you, of course. It's worth reminding you of that. But you said something very important, which is that simply, that you can't just strip away jargon and technical language or, write in a more accessible register and think that that's a trade book, which is something that we see quite often. It's a point I often make. Writing a trade book is not just stripping away jargon or writing more accessibly. You can't just write the same kind of book you've always been writing and expect it to suddenly be a trade book. And that's why we do what we do. But anyway, I don't want to derail too much on that. I want to give Sarah and Kathy a chance to jump in as well.
Well, I think to be a little optimistic about books, to Clive's point about, let's say, fewer journalists coming through the ranks, what happened to, let's say, the magazine world, completely gutted, did not happen to books. We are still here, but in a different form. And I do think it's tricky. I think that if, right, as folks tuning in are educators, like they know about the reading crisis from their students, it's not going to get better. And I do think publishers do think about how do you convert a non-reader into a reader, in a way that we just assume that there were categories of readers that would come to books before. But in terms of the sort of like larger question of, if we have, let's say, a happy next chapter in the White House, I would just like prepare for the worst and secretly nurse the best. I think it's not just politics, right? It's sort of right, that very famous quote of like, the future never comes. The future's always uncertain. But I think at this point, thinking about AI, thinking about the rising cost of living when you're working like 2 jobs or 3 jobs and then you're reading a book, like why are you going to be reading a book? And I think a lot of that has to do with your own personal curiosity, right? Like making sense of the world around you. I think if you're a book that could promise that you will really change the daily texture of that person's reality, like that is a huge, huge pitch. And so from a developmental standpoint, it's sort of walking into the wilderness and thinking you have your thesis, which is the only academic thing about this sort of book writing process, but being open to like the most cosmic sense, the most sort of abundant sense of where this project can be. And of course, like every project has like a million different grooves that it can take, but all of those grooves or structures or scaffolding will not be viewed equally commercially viable, let's say, by publishers. So I do feel like the work that you do, John, in your organization is very much like the work that an agent does, which is, right, like how do we deeply kind of center this to a kind of gap in the market, even if that gap is like, this is a new perspective. I do feel like pinpointing what other books don't cover that your book does. So a lot of times I think a good algorithm is like, if you're the first book, right, that uncovers something that would otherwise be locked up in a lab or the ivory tower, that is a true value add to a publisher. So really kind of developing your book from a defensive standpoint, thinking that like at the end of the day for this proposal, no one actually wants to publish it. Publishers, editors, sales, marketing, publicity, they're all reading with an eye to saying no. So if editorially you can make that book undeniable and you sort of move them and you make them feel something and they transcend, then they're going to be emotional about it and they're going to want that book to be out in the world.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I mean, so much of what I find myself saying again and again at these retreats and workshops is what you just said much more eloquently. If you can get people to be emotional about it, is to write from the kind of affective point of view. Think about your readers' feelings around what you're trying to do, which is something we're not used to in academia, or this audience is simply not used to in academia, right? Where everything begins with the intellect and with the argument. Right. Sorry, Kathy.
I was just going to say, it goes back to storytelling, right? And what makes us human. Another more recent favorite of mine is Patrick Radden Keefe, and I'm reading London Falling right now. He also did a book called Say Nothing about the IRA. It's an interesting story. I don't know if any of us have read it here, but he takes a death of a young 20-something boy in London, and his parents trying to find out what happened, into a much bigger story about where London is today, and the social backgrounds of London, and the Russian oligarchs that come in, and it's very, very interesting. And he tells it in this story from this one, from this kid's death, and the parents trying to find out what happened to him ultimately. I don't want to give too much away, but I think again, in this storm of we don't know where it's going, it always goes back to storytelling, and it goes back to what can I get out of the story that I learn about us being human, as us being as people. What do I learn about myself? And again, I think that's the success of Eric Larson too, is that he makes it, talks about big historic time periods, but through the eyes of one person, or two people. And I think that is a very successful way to package something, if we're going to use a marketing term, in a way to make something sellable. So yeah.
Looking for like rays of hope here, right?
What's that?
I'm just thinking, looking for rays of hope as well
Oh,
here.
yeah.
I'm wondering, you know, it, sometimes you hear about how like young people, like beyond Gen Z, like Gen Alpha or whatever it is, are going very analog. Like they're rejecting their social media. They're like buying cassette tapes, and like reading is cool again. Among very young people, they like to have go to the library and like buy books and like all of that kind of stuff. And I wonder, is that over optimistic, or is there maybe another generation coming up behind this one that is going to really surprise us by really turning to books again? I mean, is there do any of you have a sense of that?
I love that. I don't know about the very, very young, but I see, just sort of being based in New York, that, you know, to also someone's point here, maybe it was yours, Kathy, in terms of Barnes and Noble, thanks to like the rejuvenation from like James Donn, like they're beautiful places to be. And what's also so successful about them is not necessarily that they're bookstores, they're third spaces. And so I do think that there's a younger generation, but maybe not that young. Who knows? What do I know in terms of today's youth? But like having reading parties is a thing. Especially on Instagram, I feel like there's something called like reading rhythms, and it's just using the idea of a third space to like come together with strangers of all walks of life and like read a book. And that is wonderful. To have also like discoverability in that way. So like, yes, that is my hope, that like those seeds continue to grow, and like we're not going to stop publishing books. The machinery isn't going away. What it just means is it's just like harder than ever to launch new voices. And I know a lot of folks out there always want Rebecca Solnit's career. And what they don't think about is like, well, how did she get there?
Right.
And so what that means as an academic, is, right, like whether you're publishing for tenure or for various reasons for your job, you might publish with a university press. Then you might think, okay, this big idea is so big, it will be my doorway to publish with mainstream publishing. The worst case scenario, mainstream publishing says, no, you should have 3 or 4 other ideas ready to go. And the idea being, where do you put your energies, because they're limited? do you keep on working on that project or do you start something new? And what's really important too is sales track. Publishing fetishizes the debut because it means there's no sales track. So if you've published with an academic press, doesn't count. It's the zero, it's free. Those numbers, they're not real for a trade publisher.
Right.
So I also think if, you go on submission and the worst case scenario is that book doesn't sell in the first round, right? Like you want to make sure that when you do that sort of doorway, it is like the biggest possible book for you so that it can then enable all the other books that you want to write after, right? Because you do only get your first book once. And so there are a lot of different strategies. And the idea is like, how do you get review coverage, right? Like, how do you get even in the trades, like Publishers Weekly, to like look at your book that was published by Oxford University Press? And I think having great coverage of your academic books like really does help for when you are set up to then publish for the first time, which technically won't be the first time, but it'll be viewed as the first time with a trade publisher.
It's very, what you're saying is very interesting and actually very important for a lot of people to pay attention to, because what that means in effect is that from the publishing industry's perspective, there's no real difference between a junior scholar writing their first book and your senior scholar writing their fifth book. And that's one of those things that actually Clive has helped me understand recently because, a lot for the first couple of years I was doing this, all of my marketing was helping senior scholars to publish trade books because I was coming from an academic perspective as well, where those are the people who do trade books. Are people, you earn the right to do that after you've written a few books and you're a bit longer in the tooth and you've got something to say and and you're kind of a big authority in your field now. Well, guess what? In the real world, or rather in the commercial world of trade publishing, they don't look at things that way. There isn't this kind of hierarchical approach that we have in academia sometimes. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. I mean, junior scholars can be more exciting see, the agent is nodding her head because she knows that you see the potential, you see a career arc there, you see a hot new commodity that you can actually go out there and market and have get several books out of. So I hope if there are junior scholars watching this as well, we've really tried to pivot a lot of what we do so that we are, what we're doing is taking your needs into account as well. I am aware that can be complicated within the tenure structure, but I think a lot of that is changing as well. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that.
Just to sound a little cheeky,
Please.
that, junior writers, junior academics are probably a little bit more teachable in the sense of a more commercial writing style too for trade book, where as somebody who comes in who's already written 10 or 15 academic books, it might be a little bit harder for them to change gears in their head. So
absolutely, you bring a lot of advantages, a certain hipness as well. More kind of with the lingo and and the social media, more willingness to kind of go out there and to kind of understand that landscape a bit more. I mean, there's a lot that you bring as a junior scholar, which is, by the way, we're not trying to discourage the senior scholars or tell you that you're past it or anything like that.
That's why I'm trying to be cheeky.
The vast majority of clients we work with are senior scholars, people our age and older. I also, while we're on this topic, I do want to mention, in terms of resources that we have, obviously we're doing this as a free conversation because we love talking about these things and want to help you guys out. There's a ton of other free resources on our website, blogs and videos and so on. I also just want to remind you all that we have a retreat coming up in November. If any of this conversation is leaving you feeling like, wow, this is a tough landscape to navigate, it's true, it is, and it's getting tougher every day. But that doesn't our goal here is not to discourage. We wouldn't be doing this if and as Sarah says, they're still going to publish books. We still want books. We're not. This is not about, oh, the gates are closing and the drain is circling and you better, this is all kind of hopeless. I wouldn't be here if I thought that. If anything, honestly, obviously I'm not impartial here when I say this, but I think that makes what we do even more important and it gives me even greater sense of urgency around what we're doing, which is that we want to help you get there. It's a tougher landscape than it's ever been, which means more than ever, you can't just dial it in, phone it in, write the same kind of book you've always written and just expect more people to read it and call that a trade book. And we're here to help you. And one of the best ways we can help, if you are interested, in November, we're doing a 3-day retreat in Austin, Texas. Clive will be there. One of our other senior coaches, Andrew, will be there as well. 4 agents actually will be there for a Shark Tank evening. That's where you pitch your ideas to the agents. We're going to do lots of sessions on how to do a book proposal, how to find an agent, how to reconceptualize your ideas, how to make the mindset shift. We'll do a lot of writing exercises, how to kind of change the your voice as a writer, etc. We'll have someone talking about op-eds, about magazine writing, all these things in 3 days. People who have come to these things find them really, really transformative. So if you haven't signed up yet, get on that. We're still, for a couple more days, running an early bird special as well on this. I think by the time we get this video out, hopefully it won't have expired. So I want to tell you about that. We're also doing a video course on how to do a proposal and all kinds of other new things as well. In addition, of course, to our individualized coaching programs. I don't want to take up too much time here pitching the things we do, but you know that you can just go to our website and learn more about them, or simply send me an email or send our team an email. Any other thoughts while we've been kind of ruminating?
I wanted to offer something which is both encouraging and discouraging at once, but it sort of quantifies the problem. And this is a true story. So an academic whose background matches very many of the people that might be considering working with scholars to storytellers, established, freed from any tenure obligation, had a very good contract with Simon & Schuster for his previous book. In fact, I think got $500,000 for that book. And the book didn't justify that advance when it was published. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, Simon & Schuster weren't as enthusiastic about his next offering. This happens all the time in publishing. But he didn't crash and burn completely. He sold a 2-book deal to a different publisher for $400,000. So you could say, on the one hand, well, that's a big downgrade from 500 for one to 400 for two. On the other hand, you could say that's $400,000 for 2 books. That's not so shabby. And I think both things are true at the moment. There is a more conservative risk approach from publishers. And, it makes it harder for agents to get those really big deals unless you're dealing with very high profile writers. But there is still an industry there. And there are still people who want to publish good books, and there are still people who will stretch, they will stretch perhaps more modestly than they used to, but there's money to be had. So the industry is not dead and buried. It's just adjusting. It's a little bumpy.
And that is the kind of downgrade that I think a lot of people watching this would be more than happy to have, right? The kind that you just described. And by the way, it's important for us results may vary. You're probably not going to get $500,000 on your first shot at a trade book. I mean, you might, but we do want to manage expectations. But you might be surprised what is out there and what is possible, right, these days. Anything else? Anyone else want to jump in while we're on that topic? Are you still seeing big deals like that, Sarah?
So as an agent, I don't like to talk about money. I like to say it can sell anywhere from 0 to 6 figures and leave it at that. But I do think it really, again, emotion, it really depends. I'd say if one can generalize, we're not in 2020 anymore. So like advances really have gone down, especially if you're an author. And let's say your option project is up for consideration at your house and you've done really well, hit the New York Times bestseller list. Maybe you have a path to earning out that advance. I am used to seeing something that would be aggressive, that would take into account the success. Your book doesn't have to earn out for the publisher to make money. And I'll say it's, what I've seen from other editors have told me this too, and other agents is we sort of start shopping around those option projects because, that house is not offering the level they should. A lot of times there's a good argument to obviously stay. They know what that book is worth. And you can always earn it out at royalties. So that's another good thing to say too, is let's say the advanced level is lower. Mm-hmm. Well, logic dictates you have less to earn out to then see royalties, which of course, again, are never guaranteed.
Right. No, absolutely.
I actually, just because Sarah brought it up. So 2020 is a really interesting year for anybody who's studied publishing accounts. It's a tremendous spike. And it's an aberration. And of course, 2020 was the first year of full COVID. Uh, and a lot of people retreated to books, and momentarily everybody thought, wow, this may be how we get through COVID. We have more time to read. Lots of parents bought books for their children. They bought books for themselves, and those books are probably still sitting exactly where they put them down on the floor. So to some extent, what you're getting now in publishing is the correction from the spike of 2020. And it's not as big a drop off actually in overall trend lines as it would be without that period. So again, I think it's reason to be not too pessimistic, at least. I think there are things that we also have to learn. If other people have got really good at storytelling in other media, and there are some tremendous podcasts out there, then we have to match it. We have to better it. We have to offer as compelling a reason to go to books. But this is my last word on the subject. I think there's also an increasing number of people who are discovering that those other media are not completely satisfying, that they don't take in information as lastingly or as meaningfully or as deeply through any of those other media, that screens actually don't cut it, and that books are an unbelievably straightforward and yet unbelievably complex technology that we have yet to fully appreciate, perhaps. And I think readers across all generations are reckoning with that. So we may need to retrain them, in which case let's just give them something good.
I was going to say something very similar to that, probably a little less eloquent than you did. But I do think, talking about the younger generation and the future, I think a lot of these kids are going to protest these screens and really want to be, being in front of another person in 3D and reading a more long form. If anything, because there's so many studies coming out about how we are losing our critical thinking and how even reading on screens, we retain a lot less than reading an actual book. So I think there's going to be a thirst for it for sure. That definitely gives me some hope. And then hopefully this is just a correction and we're going to see that ebb and flow continue. So that helps end us on a bright note, right?
It is so nice to be able to end on a hopeful note like this. And I actually think, but I think a lot of what all three of you are saying is actually it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I don't think it's just kind of wishful thinking. And I hope the audience, those of you who are still with us, can absorb this. The point, again, I mean, I really do believe that, the reason for us to be having this conversation is to leave you with a feeling of positivity and hope and like agency. And the agency part we can help to provide, of course. If you'd like to work with us and talk to us, we're always happy to just have a conversation with you, and talk about your book ideas and see if there are ways that we can help. But the important thing is not to kind of despair and listen to the kind of the dark mood music out there and think, well, what's the point? Quite the opposite. It's amazing to me over the 20 plus years that I've been around academia and publishing and so forth, how consistently I have heard from publishers and agents, we want academics. We want serious, smart experts who can make ideas really interesting for the general public. And that hasn't changed. Some of the format that people absorb these things might be changing. There may be some temporary things that are going on, some corrections, as Clive puts it. And those are just challenges that we have to face together. And we're happy to be here to work with you on that. And you're not alone. That's the message. That's part of why we do what we do, and we encourage you to check out some of the resources we make available. So I hope that's uplifted your spirits a little bit. It's uplifted mine. I went into this thinking this was going to be a conversation about the crisis in nonfiction publishing, and instead I'm feeling like, oh, there's actually a lot of rays of hope. So thank you to the three of you for giving us that hope. So Clive Brittle, Sarah Levitt, Catherine Huck. Really, really grateful to all three of you. Check us out, www.scholars2storytellers.com. That's TO. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all very